And hello, welcome to the Time of Monsters podcast. I'm Marshall, and I'm here to talk to you in our second episode about the Trump administration, the coming Trump administration, and everything to do with that. Today's episode is the Pax Americana, or rather, we're talking about the end of the Pax Americana. So, we're going to talk about what that is and what that means so that folks can kind of get a handle of what's happening all around me. I have friends and family members, people that I know, love, and care about who are very much alarmed by the Trump administration, his preliminary proposed cabinet picks, the Agenda 2025, and all of these other things that this guy has in mind. We'll see what of that is going to happen. But the fact of the matter is, I'm a firm believer that we are looking at the end of the Pax Americana, and the Trump administration is simply sort of uh, the catalyst, if you will, that's going to kind of bring it home for everyone. But this is actually just one more bump on a downhill road that we've been on for quite a while. So I want to talk about that. Checking the audio, and it looks good. All right, so let's talk about the Pax Americana. It comes from a term from Roman history. In Roman history, there's a period called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And the Peace of Rome lasted from about 90 AD to 180 AD. And it was a period in history where the Roman Empire was at its height. It's really the height, the apex, if you will, of Roman civilization. Certainly in Western Europe, it was. The Roman Empire, after 180 AD, with the death of Marcus Aurelius, you get this slow 2-century decline until 476 AD, when the Roman Empire finally collapses in the West. You do have an Eastern Roman Empire that flourishes in what's called Byzantium, or later Constantinople as we know it, or today it would be Istanbul, Turkey. But that is a whole nother matter and aside from the point. So we're not going to bother with that. But what we have during the period of the Pax Romana is we have essentially Roman civilization at its height. We have a relative period of peace. Rome is no longer expanding so much, but rather they are sort of consolidating their power. They're taking advantage of this tremendous empire. There is some expansion that goes on, but you still have problems. You have the barbarians in the north, you have them in the east and the northeast. So there are still issues within the empire. There are still problems, but the Roman society is able to handle them very comfortably, more or less. Now, this doesn't mean that Roman society is a place where I would want to live. In the time of the Roman Empire, it was a highly stratified society. And if you were not born into the upper crust of that society, you probably weren't going very far. It wasn't exactly a time of great opportunity. But again, it was the apex, if you will, the high point of Roman civilization. And for that reason, we tend to view it quite romantically. There was a lot of construction projects and other things going on. Great things were being built then. And also afterwards, the Colosseum, for example, the Flavian Amphitheater came later and so on. But these things were all built up. At least I believe the Flavian Amphitheater was built later. But these things were built up, and we just think of it as peak Roman civilization. Well, when we think about peak American civilization, that's going to be Pax Americana. Historians date it variously. Typically, it's dated after the end of World War II. It was this time when, hey, we have the bomb. We are now this unrivaled superpower. There is a short period before the Soviet Union gets the bomb. Then they become a superpower, but name only, really. Yes, they have the bomb, but they don't have the economic power. Yes, they have somewhat of an empire that extends mostly into Eastern Europe and even into the Americas and Africa and some places and down into Asia, places like Vietnam, for example. But ultimately, that's a very weak empire. Now, growing up when in the 80s, we didn't know that the Soviet Union was as weak as it was, but it was weak. The American nation, however, was bar none the most capable and powerful nation on the planet. Um, there are people who would date the Pax Americana from the end of the American Civil War. And I think that's a logical way also of looking at it, although we really didn't come out of our shell until the Spanish American War in, I believe, 1898 and so on. But ultimately, this was a century or more of American hegemony and dominance all around the world, where really other nations could not mess with us and survive. The exceptions to that, of course, were North Korea in the 1950s, where we fought them to a stalemate when they were joined by China in the Korean War in 1953, when it came to an end at the 38th parallel. Vietnam, of course, was a war that we widely consider a war that we lost because, well, we did. South Vietnam collapsed and Vietnam was unified under a communist government. But aside from those losses, which took place overseas, halfway around the world in other countries, life here in America was pretty good. Now, it was pretty good if you're part of the in group. If you're part of a minority population, it wasn't so great. But even minorities and women saw over time throughout the 20th century a gradual improvement of their socioeconomic and political condition. Women gained the right to vote early on, I believe 1919. Black folks and others began to enjoy increasing equality and equity in society. We still haven't arrived, mind you, but again, civil rights movement and other things, the progressive movement under FDR and others, those things such as the New Deal economics, things like unemployment insurance and Social Security and the minimum wage, all of these things strengthened everything for Main Street American society. And it really allowed the boomer generation, if you will, to amass a tremendous quantity of wealth and enjoy a very high standard of living. Those, of course, for many of us are our parents. Those of us who are my age, who are now 50 and so on, Generation X. And of course, Generation X had a fantastic upbringing. You know, we grew up in the 80s, which was a great time. You know, we saw the advent of video gaming. We had all the coolest gadgets. We didn't have to fight in a big war. For most of us, we were put on a track to go to college and gain a higher education. Things were pretty good. But what we didn't realize was that as early as 1970, with the birth of libertarianism and neoliberal economic philosophy, where that begins to take hold, and we see it really take root with the Reagan administration, we see all of this deregulation of Wall Street. At the same time, we see a technical development on the tech side where we get globalization. And so between those two things, we begin to see in the 90s, actually is in the late 80s, we began to recognize it, that American jobs are being outsourced to other nations and that we were beginning to lose our grip on economic dominance. But by that time, America was such an economic and military and otherwise global political powerhouse. America was so strong and capable that we could never imagine all of that just kind of slipping away. And yet it did exactly that. That's exactly what happened. And that's where we're at today. By 9/11, which for me is just kind of to me, that's where I kind of date the end of the Pax Americana. But I think you could actually go all the way back to the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. You know, historians debate these things all the time. So there's not going to be somebody who says this is exactly it. You might find some historians who come along lately and say, well, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 or the arrival of the coronavirus pandemic in 2019, something like that. You know, again, history is a gray area. It's very complicated and there's a lot of debate. For me, I tend to date it from 9/11, but I also recognize that that's an arbitrary moment in history because the attack on the United States by Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda is not the thing that basically put us on this downhill slope, if you will, that we've been on for the past 20, 30 years or so. It was just one of the moments of high relief. Maybe in a way, it was the first big bump where we were all kind of startled awake. Oh my gosh, things are starting to get out of control. And they have been for us. And now we have had some economic good times, but most of those economic good times have been enjoyed by the people at the top. And if you look at the economic indicators that say, oh, hey, things are going great, well, that's true. Things are going great for the people at the top. They're going great for Wall Street and the people who have bought into Wall Street. But for the vast majority of Americans, the people on Main Street, things have not gone so well. There was relief during the first Trump administration. I was on a podcast last week where I got into quite a heated argument with my counterpart, who was arguing that things were better during the first Trump administration. And to some degree, he was correct, at least from a household perspective, because we had low interest rates, we had easy credit, we had stimulus coming in the form of tax cuts, reduced interest rates, and direct stimulus checks. So, yeah, we were all flush with cash. We had extra money if you had the ability to work, if you were not unemployed. The money that was being given out because of the emergency circumstances, we didn't have time to develop means tests for it. So we just gave everybody checks. So if you were working, all of a sudden, in the middle of all that, you'd get a check for $1,600 or $1,200, let's say, or whatever. And hey, that's free and easy money. And you can do things with that money, and you can invest that money. And people got into cryptocurrency, and the cryptocurrency market was on the rise, and people made a lot of money doing all of that. And so that was good times for a lot of people. But of course, it comes to an end. You have to pay for it. And all of the Trump era stimulus, the bill for that came due during the Biden administration, chiefly in the form of inflation. And you fight inflation by raising interest rates, which now means that debt and expenses and everything else go up. Of course, that inflation is not directly tied to the COVID stimulus. What actually happened was Wall Street realized that they could use COVID and they could use inflation to reduce the size of goods and services that are provided to you and the quality of those goods and services while simultaneously raising prices. That's why your candy bars and your boxes of crackers and everything else got smaller. And the quality and the flavor of these things diminished at the grocery store, but your grocery bill went up. And now people kind of got wise to it, and there's been public outcry and pushback against it. So it has somewhat stopped. At this point in time, consumers are stretched to the maximum, and they are crying for relief. And of course, many people have turned to Donald Trump, who says, hey, I'm going to save you from high inflation and high prices and so on by doing this, that, and the other thing. The problem with the Trump administration, and the reason why it's a big step forward on the collapse of the Pax Americana, is because none of his policies or plans, none of his proposals even make economic sense. For example, he wants to deport millions of illegal immigrants who are in the country. Now, I have previously said that nations have the right to defend their borders, and I believe that's true. Now, I am pro-immigration, and I don't believe that we should hunt down people who have come into the country illegally. I believe that 99% of the people who come to the country illegally do so because they genuinely want to work and build a better life. I think we need to find these people and put them on a track to amnesty, because we don't want people here illegally. And it's not that we don't want them here, we want them here. And we can accomplish this, of course, through liberalizing our immigration policy. But the thing is we need to find these people and we need to bring them into the path to citizenship, because we don't want them to be exploited. At least that's my take on it. The problem with illegal immigrants is they are the most exploited workers in our society. And of course, they form the backbone of a lot of the menial labor that goes on around us, in particular the agricultural labor. If Donald Trump were somehow able to round up these people and deport them en masse, something number one, I don't think he can do it. I don't think he will do it. And I think the moment he tries to do it, he'll get a lot of pushback. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't even think he has the competency to make it happen, nor will his cabinet officials, as the cabinet he's proposed so far, I don't think they will have the competency to actually make it happen. Will there be deportations? Yes, some. Will they be touted by the media and promoted by the White House to say, look at all these people we're throwing out? Yes, but it's actually only going to be a tiny fraction. is there are a lot of practical problems with it. And of course, Trump will realize, and hopefully before it's too late, that this policy of hostility towards migrant workers in America is going to be counterproductive economically. I think he'll wisely figure that out. I think he's smart enough to catch that and he'll let it go. But of course, right now, he's scoring a lot of political points. He's slam dunking, if you will, to get political points on this issue. But when it comes time to happen, I'm not so sure it's going to happen. So I don't think we need to panic about it. On the other hand, if he is successful, yeah, definitely panic because that's going to create a lot of economic disruption and possibly even some degree of civil unrest. I wouldn't expect much in the way of civil unrest, if any at all, but I would expect massive economic disruption for everyone. I would expect higher prices. I would expect inflation to go up because the crops that are out here in these fields that are around me, they're going to have to be harvested. And who are you going to get to harvest them? Now, I think we should pay the workers who are out there harvesting those crops reasonably well. But if they're not out there to do that, and we have to hire unemployed Americans to do that, which is just fine by me, but we're going to have to be on the up and up with them. And that means we're going to pay them what we pay workers across every other segment. And of course, that means state minimum wages in most states, otherwise federal. But in all cases, the price that we pay workers is going to go up. And the end result of that is your inflation, the costs you pay for food, for goods and services is also going to rise. So I don't think Trump wants that hot potato. And once he realizes that that's going to be the consequence of mass deportations or even attempting to perform mass deportations, I think he will back off. And even if he insists on going forward with it, I don't think he has the means or the competency within the entire White House to actually make it happen. So I'm not so worried about that. But there are other things that Trump is going to do. For example, the very fact that he's staffing the White House with people whose first criteria is loyalty rather than competency. The end result of that is going to be a weak administration, an administration that is very weak at a time of rising challenge to the United States and our economic position in the world. Again, look at BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, China, and a coalition of other countries that are trying to move away from the United States dollar as the global reserve currency, and China trying to institute the yuan, the Chinese dollar, if you will, as the global reserve currency. And they're going to be very successful at it. And they're going to be even more successful at it because the Trump administration is not going to be capable of fighting off or resisting any longer. But the fact of the matter is, had Trump not been elected, had Kamala Harris been elected, we would still see the decline and the end of the Pax Americana, just as the Romans did. Because even though the Romans got good emperors, they got people like Diocletian and Constantine and Theodosius and others, the empire still collapsed. It still fell. All the good emperors were able to do was slow the decline of the empire, but they couldn't stop it. It's inevitable. That's because, in a way, the very things that bring something up also pull it down. It's the same way that the market works. It's a thing called the business cycle. The stock market works exactly the same way. We have an institution called the Federal Reserve that moderates the business cycle so that you and I, as people on the street, don't feel the highs and the lows so much. But it applies across the board. It's a natural thing. It's sort of the waveform, if you will. And it's expressed at every level of nature, and including in our economics, and including in our politics, we see it. There's a thing called the dynastic cycle. And you can really see it very clearly if you look at Chinese history, which is often used as the textbook for the dynastic cycle. But to bring all this back to a point, the fact is the American empire is coming to an end. It's not all bad, because other nations that have been broadly exploited by America and Britain and other nations historically, this is going to be their moment to kind of break out and grow and develop and establish themselves as leaders and players, if you will, in their own local regions, for better or for worse. But these people, these civilizations, They deserve that opportunity to determine for themselves the path that they're going to be on and to make their own fortune in their own way in the world without being under the thumb of some hegemony such as the United States or Britain or anyone else for that matter. Now, this isn't to say that they won't be under the thumb of states like China or Russia or Brazil or whatever. The BRICS, community, if you will, may be just as ruthless to them as we were, and the British were, and the Spanish were, and the Portuguese and the Dutch were before. But let's hope not. Nonetheless, for us as Americans, we're going to have to do some soul searching. No longer are we going to be able to take resources from the rest of the world at rock bottom basement prices and bring those resources as manufactured goods into our homes and consume them again for rock bottom prices. That's over. Those days are gone. We're not going to go back to the 2016 or 19 or 20 or the good old days under Trump that people think that they had. We're certainly not going to go back to the good old days under Obama or George W., and certainly not under Clinton or Reagan or any of the time before. All those times that are behind us are behind us. They're in the past. It's rougher times ahead. And I don't see any other way to put that to you. You just have to put it to people bluntly. It's just part of the decline of a civilization. Now, this doesn't mean we're going to be starving in the streets or that there's going to be some terrible famine or that everybody's going to be unemployed or that there's going to be a civil war or any of these things that people might otherwise fear. It simply means that we're going to have to find a way to make do with less. Our ancestors, even right here in America, made do with less. You might have to go back a couple generations, but they had happy and fulfilling lives because life is not made fulfilling by the cheapness and the quantity of the stuff that you acquire around you. Life is made fulfilling by obtaining satisfaction, finding satisfaction with what you have, whether it be a lot or a little. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be outraged. We have every reason to be outraged. There are people at the top who have robbed an entire generation or two now of what should have been their birthright. People who have accumulated the wealth of all these people laboring and working for them, and they have hoarded that wealth onto themselves. That's the 1%, as we tend to refer to them. But I think the number is even smaller than that of the people who are truly, truly complicit and responsible for that. But at the end of the day, what can we do? I think the way forward is for us to band together and organize, particularly on the left. People are about to realize that the whole right wing Trump propaganda cycle that says, hey, if you just deregulate a little more and cut taxes and throw the illegal immigrants out and let Wall Street do what Wall Street does, everyone's going to prosper. I'll even cut your taxes. Well, that's nice, except someone's got to pay for all this. And second of all, what good does it do to cut my taxes if I haven't got a job? If my job has been outsourced, or if I've been replaced by robots or AI or something else, if I don't have the money to consume, or if my neighbors don't have jobs or the money to consume, that's going to affect me also. Because at the end of the day, why would you produce for someone or a community that cannot really consume? Instead, we're going to see production and the goods of the earth, if you will, that we have taken for granted in our beautiful big box and department stores. That's going to happen in other parts of the world now. It's the other parts of the world turn to enjoy the largesse that we have taken for granted for so long. We're going on a diet here economically. So what do we do in response to that? Again, I think we organize. We have to find a sense of community. Again, the things that make life worth living are found in the people, not the things that are around us. So we really have to find a way to reconnect with our community. We have to join clubs, find groups, find hobbies that aren't just, click, click, click on the computer. Find other things to do that connect us to our neighbors. And I think if we can do things like that, and if we can organize into communities, and they can be virtual communities, not everybody wants to go out and mingle or has that, extroverted personality, that's fine. But engage with your community somehow. And for one, that will give you something to do. It will take your mind off what you have already lost and can no longer regain anyway. And what it will do is it will open up new opportunities for you. It will show us a path forward. When we organize, for example, we'll be able to demand more of our elected representatives and more of the people at the top because we're organized now. We need to come back together. We need to reestablish the union movement, the labor movement, if you will, in this country. We'll be better able to defend those who cannot defend themselves. That includes not only people who might be here illegally, who we really do need to invite into the fold so that they're not exploited, but also people who are of various oppressed identities, traditionally underrepresented identities. This includes people who are not straight. This includes people who might be considered trans. This includes people who are handicapped or disabled or neurodivergent. This includes every minority there is in the book. And when we go out into the community and we engage with these people, even if it seems like it's superficial engagement, we form a gaming club, we form a flower society, we form a gardening group, we form a camping group or whatever, a hobby or interest group. But when we go out there and we form these groups and these societies, we strengthen our communities and our neighborhoods. We strengthen ourselves. We give ourselves outlets for our anxiety. We give ourselves mutual support because you lose your job. Well, maybe somebody in your car club or your flower society or your gaming group knows somebody else who's hiring. Maybe you meet other people who are like-minded like you and you can start a business or something together. There are things that you can do when you are together. And that's what we have to do. That's how we have to respond to the end of the Pax Americana. The gravy train has left the station, folks. We're on foot. And we can try to make it to the destination on foot by ourselves. But I think we can go a lot further and we can pull a lot more weight if we cooperate and work together. Because that allows some people who can no longer pull to take a break and allows those of us who can pull to make their way at the head of the column, pulling the burdens for all of us. So for me, I think that's the solution. That's the approach we have to take. The end of the Pax Americana isn't necessarily a tragedy. We may feel that it's a tragedy, but I don't think it is. I think it's an opportunity, not only for other people in the world who historically have been disenfranchised, but also for us. And so I think if we consider my prescription and we take it, I think we'll see benefits of it. I know there's a lot of alarm and concern about the Trump administration. But just as I've explained to you previously that the Trump administration is probably going to fumble and forget about the whole mass deportation thing, the similar things are going to bring down that administration on other fronts. I think at the end of the day, we can count on the incompetency of the Trump administration and the Trump cabinet, at least the one that he's trying to put together right now, we can count on them to fail in the first 1 or 2 years. At the midterms, we'll elect people who will block the Trump agenda, and that will be the end of Trump's worst impulses and efforts. I think he's going to fumble. But I've never been much alarmed about the Trump administration, precisely because I think the incompetence is going to be self-sabotaging. The problem with the Trump administration is what he does for us on the world stage. In other words, he's going to accelerate the collapse of the Pax Americana. But that's not necessarily a terrible thing either. The real alarm, of course, comes after Trump. Who replaces him? Once he's sort of undermined our democratic institutions and invited every other felon on the planet to run for president and maybe get elected and all of these other things. But I do think we'll have a bad enough taste in our mouth of his administration that we will pivot to the left and we will consider more socially radical ideas that aren't actually radical at all, but they go back to Roosevelt and the New Deal and the progressive era, and we realize that we have to take care of each other. But even in the absence of that, remember my prescription: coming together as a community, bonding with your neighbors, finding new things to do with yourself, and basically not sitting here and pining over the old days, but rather looking to the future together, cooperatively. I think we will find that the collapse of the Pax Americana is actually a rather nice time, in fact. So it's what we make of it, as history and times always are. And I think there's a little line from Lord of the Rings, right, where Gandalf says, we can't pick the times that we're born in, but we can pick how we respond to them. And I think we have to remember that's our power at this point in time. Well, that's the end of the Time of Monsters podcast for today. I will see you folks in a week for our next episode. I hope you found some hope and inspiration from today. Until then, take care, and we'll see you then. Bye for now.